So, I know I said in the last video I was going to try to create some kind of common sense anti-capitalist sentiment. But I think before I can do that, I need to describe what I think capitalism is. And of course, I'm not an economist, I'm not a historian, I can't speak to everything. But I think there are some basic points that need to be considered. And I think they're important points. So I'm going to try to tell it like a three-part narrative here. And it's going to start in the Middle Ages. And it's going to be a narrative of large institutions, small institutions, and then large institutions again. So, beginning in the Middle Ages, institutions are large, of course. You have a very bloated mercantilist state, you have the large church, you have the aristocracy, and you have social classes. The mercantilist state is in charge of things like joint stock companies, precursors to modern companies. The feudal lords are overseeing serfs. Churches are overseeing and administering lands, oftentimes owning certain lands themselves, also worked by serfs. You have a very stratified class structure here. You have a class structure where there is an elite group in charge of economic output in some institution. What you have as a consequence of this is these institutions are in some way unified with economic output. The mercantilist state is at once in charge of its mercantile exports, whether these are textiles, whether these are spices, whether these are ships, something of that sort. And so they use economic units, the joint stock companies, to get those to come about. Think like the East India Company or something like that. Lords, they are really just producing grain for whatever their polity is. And if you're talking like the German states, they may also be a little prince or something or other. Say Hamburg or Freiburg or something. But in any case, what happens is the lower classes begin to revolt against this in the later Middle Ages. They begin to move to the cities, and they develop into what Marx will call the burgher class, or the bourgeoisie, which really just means the city dwellers. And they begin to form guilds, some of which are already pre-existing, and they form artisan shops and craftsman shops, and they begin to form a little class of independent producers. And they largely are also, and excuse me, bourgeoisie really means middle class, which is what they were at the time. Because the aristocracy and the people who were really participating in the state, they were the upper class. They had access to the most important means of economic output, which really was food at the time. Now, what would happen is this middle class would eventually take part in a series of revolts. Now, you could think of maybe the Glorious Revolution in Britain as one of these revolts, but really the most important one happens in France, and that is, of course, the French Revolution. And what happens is, as a result of these large, bloated, stratified institutions in the Middle Ages, there's this call for atomistic economics. And that's a term I use because I think it describes things very well. That economics should not exist in large, bloated institutions, but that it should exist at a very personal level. That most men, in some way or another, should have access to land. That they should be able to control their own destinies, and you see thoughts like that in Jefferson, and I'm going to touch on this more in the next video, but anyway. That is the call. That is the revolt against the church and the state and the aristocracy in France. Now, of course, this is a romantic call. This is a misguided call, because people like Robespierre demonstrate that when you call for that, somebody is going to screw things over anyway, and he kind of foreshadows Stalin in the Russian Revolution, but that's neither here nor there. The issue is, what happens is, for a time, you have decentral economics. You have it in America, you have it in Britain, and you have it in France for a little bit. Things like the enclosures enable this, the closing off of land from what was previously communal land. And what you have for a time is a very small, personal, private state of economics. And of course, what happens is, like the agglomeration of small polities into larger ones that happened in the very early Middle Ages, you have the agglomeration of different private means of economic output into larger ones in the 1800s. This is particularly an issue in America, where there was a revolt by people like the Free Soilers, who were largely against large companies buying up other people's land. This is why things like the Homestead Act were so important, because there was a push for the government to re-incentivize the formation of small businesses and of small farms. And that goes into Turner's frontier hypothesis, which argued that because we were constantly pushing on new land in America, there would be constantly a set of new, small, independent enterprises. And this will carry into what the Republicans will today talk about with regards to small business being the heart of American business in general. In any case, larger institutions again begin to form in the later 1800s. But unlike the previous institutions, where we could say there was a degree of integration with how economic output existed, there was none any longer, in my view. Whereas before, even though aristocracy and even though stratification was absolutely present, and there's no question about that, and there was still suffering and there were still terrible, terrible things taken by these people, economics, society, and state were in some degree integrated. The lords had a duty to their king. The king had a duty to his people. Now, of course, there were things like the divine right of kings which questioned this. But in any case, economic output was national. The mercantilist state engaged in national production, nationalized production. And in this way, production, the growing of food, the expropriation of resources, these were national affairs. What the large institutions of the later 1800s would eventually carry out is a state of affairs where these things were not national, these things were private, because they were an outgrowth of the post-French Revolution ideals of small private enterprise, that the state only exists to secure these private enterprises. But of course, because we don't live where everybody is exactly identical and equal, large institutions form regardless. And so you would have magnates like Rockefeller, like Carnegie, like Gould, like Fisk, who would, in my opinion, largely replicate what the large mercantilist states of the past had done. They would take on multiple enterprises, they would employ thousands of people, and this would result in things like antitrust legislation. But so the narrative here is really from large institutions to small institutions to large, again, capitalist institutions. And what makes these new institutions different from the old large institutions is exactly what happens in between, the move to small institutions, the distantiation of economic output from human society, its objectification, its turning into as something which does not need to serve the human race, which does not need to serve the human person, but which exists solely for market purposes. Whereas prior, the joint stock company was directly in service of the state and its affairs, now the joint stock company was directly in service of market affairs, of whoever the proprietor of that company is. He does not produce any longer for the state, for the people, but he merely produces for himself. Now again, that's a romantic view because the old state was for itself. It wasn't really for the people. There was slavery. There were a lot of things wrong. But this is the distantiating effect. In general. It's not everything. I need to make that very clear. And the worker no longer is working for his state. He is working for the private enterprise. He's no longer working for his people. He's working for his wage. He doesn't care what he's producing any longer. It's irrelevant to him. Because he is also distantiated. He is merely for his wage. He doesn't care about who he works with, for the most part. He doesn't really care who he works for, as long as he gets his money. Because his person is no longer integrated into society. It doesn't really matter, because society is no longer integrated into the state. Instead, all the institutions are separate. And that is the capitalistic mode of production in general. That there is a hierarchy still at play, that there are these bloated economic institutions still at play, but that they are distant and no longer integrated with the human person. That they are no longer integrated in human society either. That the human person, as a consequence, is no longer integrated into human society, but that all of these things are separate. This is a very broad brush view, like I said at the beginning. This isn't everything. I left out things here like the Protestant work ethic. I left out things like the attempts at redistribution in ancient Rome. These are important matters. They make the story more complex. This narrative is not everything. This is not the entire definition of capitalism. It's not the entire story of how it formed. But this is one perspective. And it's an important perspective to take into account. I will not argue it's even the entirely correct perspective, but it's one that is worthy of more research. I would argue that these ideas, the French Revolution, the formation of states, how states disintegrated, social transformations, these are important things that help us understand where we are today. And I hope that this has inspired you to maybe look into these things more and hopefully research them on your own time. I will try to discuss the positive and negative implications of all of this in the next video and try to get eventually into what late capitalism is and people like Horkheimer and Adorno and what the whole culture industry is, because that's a whole other damn thing. Hopefully you liked it. Let me know. I'll see you in the next one.